Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for returning from that very quick break. I would like to introduce to you our next speaker, who is Olivia Babis. She was born with a physical disability and has worked toward building a more equitable society for most of her life. She is currently the Senior Public Policy Analyst at Disability Rights Florida. She was previously the peer mentor at the Suncoast Center for Independent Living, where she assisted others with disabilities achieve independence. Olivia worked as the community organizer for the Florida Consumer Action Network, a multi-issue advocacy nonprofit where she worked on a multitude of issues, including disability rights, healthcare, expansion, wage issues, and transit. Olivia also served on the Citizens with Disabilities Advisory Board for the City of Sarasota. She has worked on a number of campaigns, and in 2018, Olivia was a candidate for the Florida Senate. I first heard her speak at the 2021 Florida SANS conference. She spoke of inclusion, accessibility, and demonstrated that she is a true advocate of the people. I am pleased to share with you, this audience, Olivia Babis.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Denise. I appreciate that introduction. As Denise said, I am the Senior Public Policy Analyst at Disability Rights Florida. I've been here for about 3 years, work in our public policy department. So I do a lot of our lobbying work, legislative education. When we're out of session, I coordinate most of our voting rights work. So we have a Voting Rights Coalition, that is a Rev Up chapter, which is part of AAPD, the American Association of People with Disabilities, who launched that campaign in 2016 to try to close the voter gap for people with disabilities, which has lagged significantly behind voters in the general population by about 6-7% for the past decade or so. So we have a Rev Up chapter here, which I hope to facilitate those meetings and all of those activities. It's a great group. I'm doing a shameless plug right now, but we've grown from what originally started as 5 members to having regularly 30 members at our meetings. We coordinated an election summit. We'll be holding another one again this year. And working on accessibility challenges throughout the voting process, from registering to vote to actually getting to the polls or voting by mail, and making sure that that process is fully accessible for people. So I wear a lot of hats here at Disability Rights Florida. I just wanted to, before we kind of jump into the meat of everything, just kind of lay a little bit of background information and kind of highlight some things. I know some of our other speakers have touched on some of this. So if I get to an area where they've already kind of explained, we'll kind of gloss over that because I don't want to be, repetitive. But, I don't want to make assumptions about people's knowledge on policy and law. This is the field that I work in, so I'm used to hearing that jargon, but I realize that not everybody works in policy every day and knows the laws and the policies that affect the disability community. So with that, I'll go ahead and jump into the next slide, just to give a little bit of background information on Disability Rights Florida and who we are and what we do. As the slide says, and I wanted to give an image description of myself, by the way. I am a middle-aged white woman with longish, medium, wavy hair that's kind of a dirty blonde color. I'm wearing glasses and a black and white striped kind of ruffly shirt. With the background behind me is for the FCIC conference, which is some geometric with some colored squares that are pink and kind of lime green, teal, and blue. And the slides that I'm reading from have the Disability Rights Florida logo on them. There's kind of an orange banner at the top, and then the slides are a dark purple color with a white text. So Disability Rights Florida was founded in 1977 as the state's designated protection and advocacy system for individuals with disabilities. The PNA network, as we're frequently referred to, although AI in closed captioning likes to call us the Panda Network, which has kind of become a running joke within the PNA network. And actually National Disability Rights Network, which is our trade association, actually started a podcast called Panda One, based on AI always editing our PNA as Panda. So, interesting fun fact for you for trivia that will never need to be used. But the PNA system was created by the Developmental Disability Assistance and Bill of Rights Act, introduced by New York State Senator Jacob Javits, which was in response to a Geraldo Rivera series exposing the horrific treatment of people with disabilities, particularly those with intellectual and developmental disabilities at the Willowbrook Institution. Has led to the closure of many state institutions. There still are several that are open, but definitely not to the extent that they used to be. We do monitoring of facilities and investigations to make sure that people are being treated appropriately in these facilities, that they're not being abused or exploited or neglected. So every state has a PNA. So Disabilities Florida is Florida's PNA. And then 7 of the US territories have a protection and advocacy organization as well. We are a nonprofit, so we are a C3, so we're not a state agency, we're not a federal agency, but we are a mandated organization per federal law. And since the PNA network was created, there have been several other laws which we receive grant funding for. So we actually, most of our funding comes from 9, actually we have 11 federal grants right now, although 2 of those are temporary. But the PNA network was expanded upon, where originally this was for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We started realizing that people across the spectrum of disability were experiencing discrimination and horrific treatment. So those additional laws and grants expanded the scope of what we can do. So now we make sure that we assist everyone with a qualifying disability, and we provide legal advocacy and rights protections for adults and children with a wide range of disabilities. Our services are free of charge. And we have the website for our PNA, which is Disability Rights Florida, all spelled out, including Florida.org. That's also the ending for our email addresses when we get to the end and have the contact information. We have the longest email addresses ever, which I apologize for profusely, but it's easy to remember. If you know Disability Rights Florida, you just spell that out, .org, and you can pretty much find anybody in our organization. If you know their name, then shoot them an email. So we'll go ahead to the next slide. So just some statistics on disability labor, and I know this was talked a little bit about with our first speaker. The most recent data that has come out in a report that was issued by the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics report from February of 2022 gives the statistics for 2021, which is the most recent data available, which indicated that 19.1% of people, so almost 20% of people working age, which is defined as 16 to 64 with disabilities, were employed. And that's compared to 63.7% of our non-disabled peers. These numbers, we can tell, have been impacted by COVID. These numbers used to be closer to approximately 30% for people with disabilities and around 70-75% for those without disabilities. So we can see that these numbers have dropped, but more significantly for people with disabilities. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities is 10.1% compared to 5.1%. And approximately 80% of people with disabilities are not part of the labor force. So that means they're not currently employed, they're not underemployed, they're not looking for employment. They're not working, they're not looking for work. Part of this is because as we age, we typically develop disabilities. One of the common sayings is that if you live long enough, you will experience disability in your life if you're fortunate to make it to a ripe old age. So the disability population tends to be a little bit older. So about half of people with disabilities aren't in the labor force because of age. So they've already reached retirement age, they may have worked, but they're 75, 80, 90, 100 years old. So they're not obviously looking for work at that point. So that does skew the numbers some. But even when we're looking at the population ages 16 to 64, we still see that that is not a huge segment of the disability population that is employed at 20%. And unfortunately, these numbers have not changed significantly in the past 50 years. So we know the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in the 1990s. It is 31, about to be 32 years old now. And unfortunately, even with the passage of this law that was supposed to remove barriers to people for people with disabilities to participate in society, including the workforce, it didn't have the effect that people were kind of hoping that it would. The biggest bump up in employment that we saw for people with disabilities was actually after the passage of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. When those regulations were signed, we saw about a 10% increase in employment for people with disabilities in the late 70s, early 80s as a result of that. But like I said, those numbers have not changed significantly since that period. So we'll go to the next slide. To understand, what accommodations are and what impacts employment for people with disabilities, it's important to kind of understand the laws that impact that. And we're not going to go through all of them. There's a lot of laws that touch on disability and even in employment. But so we're just going to kind of hit some of the highlights, starting with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act is the section of the law that deals with employment. This part of the law applies to employers that have 15 or more employees. So, a small business that only has 2 or 3 people wouldn't necessarily be covered by the ADA. They would still be covered by the Rehabilitation Act. So that's not to say that they can just blatantly discriminate against people with disabilities, but they don't have to meet the same regulations as the ADA. They just have to meet the guidelines for the Rehabilitation Act, which, that they're still there, they still protect people, but not as strong as the regulations that are the product of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the ADA states that no covered entity shall discriminate against a qualified individual on the basis of disability in regard to job application procedures, the hiring, advancement, or discharge of employees, employee compensation, job training, and other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. So you cannot be discriminated against when you're applying. If you need an accommodation to apply for a job, you can make that request. You can't be offered a salary that is different than your peers that are working the same job. We know that there are some loopholes and ways around that with C14 certificates, but generally speaking, unless someone holds that certificate, they have to pay you the same rate that they would pay anybody else. Your rights under the ADA, it protects you from discrimination in all employment practices, including job application procedures, hiring, firing, training, pay, promotion, benefits, and leave. And you have the right to be free from harassment because of your disability. So if you go in for a job interview, I myself have a visible physical disability. So it's hard to tell, I know you can only see my head, but I was actually born without arms. They refer to this as congenital double upper amputee, which is a fancy way of saying that I don't have arms, and there's actually some really long Latin term for it that I never bothered to memorize because it doesn't matter to me. And I also am a power chair user. I had a leg length discrepancy when I was born, and as I grew, my right leg didn't grow at the same rate. So I had to have a shoe lift, and I got to the point where my discrepancy was around 6 inches or more. which was jeopardizing balance. I had a bunch of surgeries growing up. And because of that, I can't walk long distances. And the power chair for me is just more convenient. Anyway, I tell people it's very hard to use your hands when you're walking on them. I do everything with my feet. So it's far easier for me to have the power chair. I can carry things, put my bag on the back or my purse. I often keep my phone, people see it, kind of tucked next to my foot on my footrest of my chair, but that allows me to use my feet to be able to open doors and write things down and do all the things that you would do with your hands. So that kind of frees them up for that use when I'm not walking on them. So when I go into a job interview, people can't ask me about my disability. Since mine is visible, I always, ensure an employer that, yes, I can do the tasks of the job necessary. People do make a lot of assumptions about people with disabilities and what they think we are capable of or not capable of. But that is a question that an employer cannot ask you, or prospective employer cannot ask you about your disability in an interview or even on the job. What you decide to share with your employer about your disability is entirely up to you. You do not have to disclose disability at all if you choose not to. However, if you need accommodations for work, that is something that you'll have to disclose. And then if it's an invisible disability, sometimes we'll have to provide documentation, not of a disability, but why you need a specific accommodation that you're requesting. So those are, some of your rights under Title I of the ADA. And we'll go ahead to the next slide. An employer may not fire or discipline you for asserting your rights under the ADA. So if you need an accommodation, maybe you started a job and you thought, you could do it, you didn't need an accommodation, but you're finding that, your office setup just isn't quite right. You need maybe a standing desk that can raise and lower, or, you thought that you would be able to type. I can type actually at like an average speed, but when I'm doing it for hours on end, it can get tiresome. So, maybe you thought you would be able to type all day and you're finding that that's too hard. And so you need an accommodation, a text to type of program. They cannot discipline you for that. They cannot fire you for that. You're protected under the ADA in those circumstances. You have right to request a reasonable accommodation for the hiring process on the job. We keep hearing this term reasonable accommodation, which isn't really defined anywhere in the ADA. But that's any change or adjustment to a job, to the work environment, or the way things usually are done that would allow you to apply for a job, perform job functions, or enjoy equal access to benefits available to other individuals in the workplace. So I just want to pause here for a moment and see what are some examples of reasonable accommodations people can think of. I kind of tossed out a couple in talking about the slide, but what other accommodations have you requested, or have you requested on behalf of a client, or accommodations that you think might be useful to somebody in a work environment? And you can just kind of pop those comments in the chat if you want, or if you want to raise your hand. A note taker, right? Extra breaks. Absolutely. Job coach, definitely. Anything else? Did everybody, go to lunch and then, come back and now we're all half asleep? All right, no, those are some color coding, yes. So those are some great examples. I mentioned modifying your workspace, kind of just rearranging the furniture. Disability Rights Florida, we're Disability Rights Florida. Of course, we have people with disabilities who are employed here. We have 4 offices across the state. We have been packing our Tallahassee office, and we had a recent hire, which actually was a friend of mine that got hired on in a different department. And her office was kind of small, and she has a power chair. So we ended up, rearranging the way that the space was set up. So the desk was kind of originally in the middle of the office, and she couldn't really get around it to get her chair in and be able to close the door behind her when she's taking calls. So for her, it was just a matter of we just moved the desk up against the wall, and it created this vast open space in the middle of the room where she was able to turn her chair. And a lot of accommodations are like that. It is very simple. Maybe instead of taking an hour lunch break, people want to divide that up and, take 4 15-minute breaks on top of their other, 2 15-minute breaks that you're entitled to an 8-hour day. And they need to split the time up like that. So most accommodations for work, and there's this misconception that, oh my gosh, it's really expensive, and we're going to have to do thousands of dollars in renovations to our building to make it accessible. That's usually not the case. Usually it is free, or it's something that is a low cost accommodation, and there are organizations that can help with accommodations. I have a modified car, and I moved up to Tallahassee for my job. We bought a house. Most houses aren't just made accessible for people, so we've had to do some home renovations. The cost of living for people with disabilities is anywhere from 30 to 50% higher than the general population, even though 55% of the disability community lives at or below the poverty line. So we usually have way more month than we have money a lot of the times. So there are programs to help with some of these accommodations. I go through vocational rehabilitation. I've had, I bought my car, but they paid for the modifications, which I would not be able to afford on my own. They're helping with some of the renovations to the house, where I need a bigger shower and a bench in the shower, so I can shower independently without needing assistance. So there are methods to pay for things that can be a little more expensive. Some of our staff uses JAWS. DRF pays for that, but Voc Rehab and Division of Blind Services, oftentimes if you're already a client and you're job searching and you have a job placement, they'll assist with those costs for the employer. And there's tax credits that employers get as well for hiring people with disabilities. So it's really not as infeasible to make these kind of accommodations as people think. So go ahead to the next slide. And so what are, your responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act? And the main point, particularly under Title I, is that if you think you might need an accommodation for application process or on the job, you have to make that request. You can request a reasonable accommodation at any time during the application process or any time before or after you start working. Like I said, my disability is physical. However, there have been times where I've done job interviews and I've been able to hide my disability. As Denise mentioned, I worked a lot in campaigns and nonprofits. So I have moved around a lot. Sometimes those jobs are out of state. Campaign jobs are temporary. So you're employed by a campaign for maybe a year. Once the election happens, the campaign's over, you have another week or two where you shut down your campaign offices, but that's it, you're job searching again. So oftentimes I would be wrapping up a campaign and interviewing for another campaign that might be in another state. So I'm doing interviews through virtual environments, just like Zoom here. So the only thing they can see when they're interviewing me is my floating head. You can't tell I have a disability, and I don't have to disclose that. And anybody that has experienced disability discrimination in the employment process, and I have, there's a look that you get when you go in for an interview, particularly those of us with visible disabilities, where you can tell people are making judgments about what they think you can and can't do. Oftentimes it doesn't matter what you say in these situations. They have their beliefs about you, and that's it, and there's no changing their mind. Unfortunately, it should not be that way, but that's the way it is. And so there's been times where I've been, one of 3 candidates that was given an interview. But I could tell you when I walked out of that interview that I was not going to get that position because I know that face. We've learned it. We can recognize it. It's hard to explain to someone who's never experienced that, what that face looks like, but you know it when you see it. And so I personally have not disclosed my disability in job interviews when I don't have to, and waited until I received my hire letter, and received the job offer. And then, you know, if I needed any accommodations at work, is when I disclosed my disability. Because at that point, I've received the hire letter. I know they can't fire me. They can't withdraw that offer of employment based on my disability. Whereas when I'm going into a job interview, even though I can sense and I know it's probably because of my disability, that's really, really hard to prove. I'm not looking at other people's applications and letters of recommendation and their resumes, and I can't say, yes, absolutely, I was the most qualified person for that, and I absolutely didn't get it because of my disability. Like I said, that's really hard to prove. However, you know, you get a hire letter, and if it's revoked after disclosing disability, you know, there's a little bit more evidence to kind of back up that assertion at that point. So that's why, you know, I tend to do that, but it's up to people's preference and what they feel comfortable sharing. And some people don't disclose their disability at all if they don't need an accommodation, and that is perfectly within their rights under the ADA to do that. So also for, I think a couple of people touched on it, the Job Accommodation Network is a great source of information on possible accommodations. I know it's really hard for people that may be new to the workforce. And so you don't necessarily know what accommodation you might need in that office space. And so that gives you some ideas of accommodations others have requested, and you can kind of look through that list and see what might be beneficial to you. It's also important to remember that requesting accommodation, your employer doesn't have to necessarily grant the specific accommodation you are asking for. This is kind of think of it as a negotiation where you say, I want A, your employer might say, well, I'm willing to offer B, and then you compromise on a solution. And so, you know, you kind of get to negotiate with your employer on what's going to work best for both of you. And we'll go on to the next slide. This is a great quote. I love this quote from Martin Luther King about, you know, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, you know, a lot of people said, well, you know, we're trying to legislate attitudes, and we can't do that. We can't make other people accept a marginalized community and, you know, love them and just fully embrace them and accept them. Legislation can't do that. And that is true. So you don't have to love me, and that is fine if you don't, but you do have to accommodate me. And so the quote from Martin Luther King said, while it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me. And I think that is pretty important also. So there is a need for executive orders. There's a need for judicial decrees. There's a need for civil rights legislation on the local scale, within states, and the national scale from the federal government. And that was from his address at Western Michigan University in December of 1963. And, you know, that this, I think, rings true for most marginalized communities, including the disability community. The ADA does not make people accept us. It's not going to make people suddenly see people with disabilities as equals, but it does help level that playing field where it can regulate behavior. You can't tell me I can't go into your store because you don't serve people with disabilities. You have to. That is a requirement. And the idea behind this is that attitudes will eventually follow regulated behaviors, that once we pass laws that end segregation, that, you know, integrate people with disabilities into society, and people see people with disabilities more, included in society, then those attitudes, that morality will change in response to the law. Okay, so moving on. Next slide. We think of restrictions on employment being due to architectural barriers mostly. Like we think of the ADA as being, this groundbreaking piece of legislation, which absolutely it is very true. But issues don't exist in a bubble, right? So we can't completely separate political issues into silos and pretend that they're not connected. These are absolutely connected issues. And for people with disabilities, healthcare and employment are tied together. They are married. We cannot separate them. Many of the programs that allow us to enter the workforce, we lose access to as soon as we enter the workforce. These are often referred to as work disincentives. I refer to them as work prohibition because that actually was more in line of what it feels like. You're not disincentivizing me from going to work. I absolutely want to go to work. I am motivated to do that. However, if I have a PCA and I'm dependent upon that person to come to my house in the morning and get me out of bed and help me shower and get dressed and make sure that I get to work, I need access to that person, right? I can't lose that person because then I lose my ability to go to work. And now I've just lost my salary because I can't get to work because I don't have assistance. And then I lost access to my PCA because I earned too much money and I don't qualify for the programs that pay for that service. And my employment isn't enough. Somebody making $30,000, $40,000 a year can't afford to pay another person $30,000 or $40,000 a year to help take care of them, right? That math doesn't work, and we're not absolved of our financial responsibilities by virtue of our disability. I still have a mortgage payment. I have a car payment. I have car insurance. I have more expenses than most people because I have to maintain that modified car. So even though vocational rehabilitation helped me out with the modifications, it is my responsibility to maintain that. And with high tech, like I have, that's almost like taking care of 4 cars. My car has 3 different batteries in it, one for the ramp that I use to get in and out of the car, a battery for the system that I use to drive, and then of course the batteries that are in the car. And all of these have to be replaced every couple of years. And the batteries for the modifications and the ramp are just as much as a car battery. So, we're talking $200 per battery for really what's 4 batteries. That's $800 plus labor. So we're talking, $1,000 or more every 2 years for me to replace the batteries in my car. I have a power wheelchair. Again, I had assistance with paying for the chair. It's up to me to maintain it. Because we don't do a great job with removing architectural barriers, and we have sidewalks that are broken, and these types of things do damage to people's medical equipment. I get chips in my tires all the time from going up and down sidewalks that have cracks in them, or curb cuts that aren't quite level, and it takes little chips out of our tires, and so we have to replace these every couple of years. And it's $200-$300 per tire for a chair with 6 tires. The chair has 2 batteries that also has to be replaced. So it's almost like maintaining another car, in addition to my car that I have to do just regular maintenance on and have to maintain the modifications for. So you can start to see where all of this adds up, plus, our regular living expenses of feeding ourselves and paying for housing and clothing. And I have student loan payments like everybody else. And so this really adds up. So I can't afford to pay, a full-time person to come assist me with those tasks out of my own pocket. I will never earn enough to do that. And that is the situation that a lot of people with disabilities find themselves in, and why those numbers have been so stagnant and haven't moved. So yes, part of it is architectural barriers, part of it is our attitudinal barriers, but a lot of it is the social programs that we have set up that are antiquated and need reforms and haven't kept pace with the way that we conceptualize a disability now. In the 1970s, when the Rehabilitation Act was passed in 504, a lot of people with disabilities resided in institutions. You know, Social Security defines disability as the inability to work. And we know that's not true, but yet we haven't reformed the programs to reflect this change in attitudes about disability, to allow the disability community to go to work and fully participate in society, without taking away those things that they need in order to do so. But there have been some reforms to address some of this. The first one is what's called Section 1619, which was passed in 1980 in response to some of these problems. And so this allows Social Security income recipients to go to work and retain medical insurance and other assistance. So you can go to work and you can still keep your Medicaid. You can earn up to a threshold amount, which is equivalent to the cash value of all the assistance an individual receives, plus the amount of their impairment related expenses. I know that's kind of a confusing statement. So to break that down, you can earn up to, say, you know, I was talking about that PCA, right? So that PCA gets paid $35,000 a year to provide care to you. So you can earn up to the amount that is paid through MedWaiver, or, you know, any other program for that PCA. So you can earn that $35,000 a year salary and not lose your PCA services. And it allows for other impairment related expenses. So as I was talking about, those batteries or extra doctor's appointments, all of that stuff adds up. So you can earn an amount equal to what is spent basically on your healthcare and other related expenses to your disability. So that did increase the amount of income a person can earn, and not lose those services and maintain work. However, it has what we refer to as a financial cliff. I call it this pesky financial cliff that a lot of our programs have. And what we mean by financial cliff is that, say, you know, your total costs for your medical care and your impairment related expenses is $45,000. So you can earn a $45,000 salary. However, you get a raise and now you're earning $45,500. That $500 puts you over, that has now crossed the financial cliff. And because of that $500, you now lose access to all of those services. You no longer qualify for Section 1619, and you're kind of right back at square one. But this does allow individuals to accumulate some savings over a short duration of time that can be used for, you know, specific items needed to obtain employment. So any certifications you need or training and those kinds of things, you can accumulate savings for that without that counting towards the asset limitations, and use those funds for work-related expenses. So next slide. The other reform is what's called the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act. This was passed in the 1990s, and it made state participation optional for what's called Medicaid buy-in. So it allows individuals to go to work while retaining eligibility for Medicaid and other publicly funded services. It allows states to eliminate income and resource limits in existing benefits programs such as Medicaid. And this is for both those who receive SSI and SSDI payments. And this is really what paved the way for state Medicaid buy-in programs. 46 states have a Medicaid buy-in program. Florida does not. So unless an individual remains eligible for SSI through 1619 or another program, after 2 years with Ticket to Work in Florida, because Florida does not participate in Medicaid buy-in, you lose access again. So you kind of basically have what's sort of like a 2-year work trial period. But after those 2 years, the idea behind this was that people would be able to transition to private health insurance or employer-sponsored health insurance programs, and those would cover the costs that were previously covered by Medicaid. However, we know that insurance provided through employers and private insurance doesn't necessarily meet the needs of people with disabilities. So they don't pay for things like durable medical equipment or job coaches, personal care attendants, skilled nursing, things that people may need access to in order to maintain employment. So after that 2-year period, you lose access to that. And that's kind of the problem that we're running into in Florida and some other states through Ticket to Work, and why it hasn't been as effective as it potentially could have been. So next slide. We have ABLE accounts now, which allows individuals to save tax-free for future expenses while maintaining their benefits. Your friends and family can contribute to this. You have to have a qualifying disability that was onset prior to age 26. So people with congenital disabilities or were born with disabilities or acquired a disability early in life. Funds can only be spent on qualified disability expenses, but it's a very broad definition of what that is, much broader than the 1619 section that we were referring to. You only have to make a minimum contribution of $25. And there's a max contribution annually of $15,000. I believe that's cumulative. So this helps with the asset limits for Medicaid. So someone may go to work and they're not exceeding that financial threshold as far as their income, but they're wanting to save things, right? Like people with disabilities want to retire too one day. And a lot of us are worried about being trapped in the workforce once we enter the workforce and not being able to get back out and use retirement funds. So this is one of the kind of solutions to that allows people to set that aside tax-free, where they may not be able to contribute to their 401k because that will push them above the asset limitations. But this is kind of a way for them to be able to set funds aside for specific things like buying a house and things that people typically save up for. That would be a qualified disability expense because it is much easier to modify a house to meet our needs than it is an apartment. So there's a lot of rational and justifying reasons how those funds can be used for housing and various other expenses that are connected to disability. So next slide. The most recent reform that we've seen here in Florida is the Working People with Disabilities program, which passed in the 2019 legislative session. This was not a bill that went through session. It was kind of added in, we call it proviso language, into the budget. This program was created basically by 2 sentences in the proviso budget that passed the 2019 session. So this increases the limit people with disabilities on the med waiver programs must adhere to in order to stay on Medicaid and keep their waiver. So individuals can earn around $52,000 a year. Again, this is just for people that are on med waiver, not Medicaid managed care programs, but the iBudget waiver, the long-term care waiver, these programs that pay for PCA services and those types of supports. So they can earn up to $52,000 a year and increase the asset limit to $13,000 a year without losing benefits. Again, this is helping people dig out of poverty a little bit, increases the amount they can earn, but you still face that financial cliff. If you earn $52,300, then you potentially are looking at losing med waiver and those supports and services again. So these programs have helped, but haven't reached their full potential a lot of times because they still have those asset limits, they still have that income restriction, and they have that financial cliff built in, which is really the scary part for a lot of people with disabilities. Anybody with a disability, and I've been there myself, we are not immune from life tragedies happening to us. I was in a really severe car accident about 20 years ago now. Somebody hit me, I did not hit them. I'm a safe driver, I promise. I broke most of my ribs. I had a stress fracture in my skull and a couple of vertebrae in my back. had some internal bleeding. I was pretty banged up. My car was totaled. That takes a while to replace having to go through vocational rehabilitation. So I had to exit the workforce for a little while and go through physical therapy, and it was a long road to recovery. But I got stuck in this trap where, I was getting better. I wanted to re-enter the workforce, but this was before the ACA, Americans, that people refer to it as Obamacare, before this passed. So there were restrictions on pre-existing conditions that would be covered. So if I were to transition back into the workforce, my employer sponsored insurance would not cover anything related to my car accident, to the disability that I had since birth. So, I could enter the workforce, but I was potentially going to have to go without health care for a little while, until that time frame where, they have to start covering pre-existing conditions. This isn't as much of a problem now because of the ACA, but the ACA was not a panacea for people with disabilities. There's still a lot that private health insurance does not have to cover. And so therefore it still does not meet the needs of a lot of people. But it did help some people that have just pre-existing conditions that may have long-term care, just with doctors and diagnostic testing and, maintaining medications, that don't have durable medical equipment and don't necessarily need assistance with activities of daily living. For those individuals, they were able to enter the workforce and not have to worry about pre-existing conditions or lifetime caps or annual caps on what insurance would pay for them. So it did help a lot of people, but not everybody in the disability community, particularly those that need assistance with activities of daily living and that require durable medical equipment and those types of things. So moving on. And now finally we're getting to the meat. I know that was a lot of background information, but I think that's important to understand to kind of lay the groundwork for this. For how COVID has actually improved employment opportunities for people with disabilities. This has kind of been the one silver lining for people with disabilities through the COVID pandemic. The disability community was hit particularly hard. A lot of people with disabilities are placed in retail jobs, public facing types of positions. So this made them extremely vulnerable to getting COVID. Sometimes these are the first people to be laid off when businesses closed because of COVID, or they started rolling back services and let some of their staff go. And that really impacted people with disabilities. However, on the silver lining for this is that it really shifted attitudes around remote work and around job accommodations. We have people who never had a disability before or didn't identify as being disabled, and now they're experiencing long COVID. So they may have been sick for months. They have to go back to work, and now they're needing job accommodations. They may be really easily fatigued, and so remote work, in addition to preventing the spread of the virus and keeping us socially distanced, it also allowed people that need that flexibility to be able to work in what we refer to more as like white collar positions, so administrative positions, secretarial positions. And we discovered there is a lot that we can do online that we don't necessarily have to be in an office for. Remote work is something that the disability community really has been asking for years as a job accommodation. And really we got pushed back a lot from employers who felt that, that working from home, people weren't as productive. But we actually found that for some people, they're actually more productive at home. They can take the breaks that they need to. It removed transportation barriers because you don't have to travel to an office anymore. With people that require paratransit services, and those particularly in rural areas, these services aren't always very reliable. And so people would be late to work and, end up with, and their HR record that they were late to work and may, face some retaliation because of that. So it helped to solve a lot of these problems. And like I said, it's opening up more office and professional positions to people with disabilities. And it showed businesses that, you know, your staff kept going. Our businesses kept going at Disability Rights Florida. We shut down all 4 of our offices. We have a staff of 100 people. And we transitioned to a work from home environment. And we noticed that, you know, we were receiving increased volume and calls, but our staff was staying on top of that, that we were able to transition pretty easily to a remote environment. We have opened back up, but 70 or so % of our staff actually work remotely, either full time or like myself, or in a hybrid schedule. For me, I need to be around people occasionally. I can't work from home all the time. It just so happens that my partner and I, by happy accident, both work at Disability Rights Florida, although in very different departments. But working from home, you know, we're kind of on top of each other. Going into the office, you know, we can kind of rotate our schedules a little bit. So I can work from home by myself. I have the house to myself one day. He goes into the office or vice versa. So it kind of gives us that space and that ability to be really flexible with our schedules. A lot of, you know, work is 8 to 5, but not every job. My job is not an 8 to 5. I don't deal with clients a whole lot. Occasionally I'll consult on some of our cases, but most of my work involves research, writing reports, sending emails, reaching out to our state legislators, you know, voting rights work. My boss, I can work at 3 o'clock in the morning. As long as I'm getting my task done, I'm putting in the hours that I need to for a full-time employee. I can do that whenever I want, as long as I'm getting assignments done in a timely manner. You know, there are some meetings, obviously, the FCIC conference today as a set time, you know, I need to be present in those spaces as required. But any of my kind of administrative busy work, I can do that at any time of the day. And for a lot of people, that is really helpful. People that experience fatigue, or maybe, you know, they need to work in chunks. They can't multitask. Science shows that none of us really are very particularly good at multitasking, but we try anyway. But, you know, some people know their limitations, and they have to work on one task at a time, and maybe they need to take a break at that point. So remote work and these accommodations that we've seen being made to accommodate COVID have been really beneficial to people with disabilities, and opening up new types of work that really have not been made available or easily and readily available to people with disabilities. So this really has been beneficial in that regard. And, you know, we keep talking about returning to normal and states of emergency being lifted. But one of the things that we really want to see not change, that we want to keep in place, that really was a benefit of COVID, are the accommodations that we're offering people, you know, people with disabilities and without disabilities alike, to work in an environment and really meeting them where they're at, as long as they can do the requirements and meet the requirements of the job. They can do that wherever they need to and want to, and in the way that works best for them. So this really has allowed a lot of flexibility in the workspace. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, there we go. So a lot of times we see people thinking of employment accommodations and just accommodations that we get. I know I dealt with this growing up. You know, in school, like I got extended time for tests, but a lot of times we hear that's not fair. You know, that it's done out of pity, it's done out of charity. People don't understand like how this makes the workplace equitable for people, how, you know, it's not fair for me with testing that, you know, I get that extra time, maybe somebody else didn't finish too. You know, they may have spent an extra 15 minutes on a question that they were stumped on, whereas for me, I didn't finish not because I didn't know the answers, but because it took me longer to bubble them all in. So these types of accommodations are often seen as not being fair. For me as a kid, I often didn't want to take my accommodations because of the way that was viewed. that, other students thought that I was receiving special treatment is, what we refer to it a lot of the times. But we're seeing that as the workforce has shifted and we're allowing people to work remotely and into positions that they maybe previously hadn't, and into administrative positions and leadership roles, that this has been really beneficial for the disability community, but also for people outside of the disability community. What skills and abilities people with disabilities bring to the workforce. And often we don't see the value in that. We don't see disability necessarily as a positive. It's still very much societally viewed as a negative. It's something to avoid. You don't want that. You want to be like that person. But we're finding that actually people with disabilities have a lot to bring to the table. So the coping skills that you learn to deal with your disability often translate into valuable professional skill sets. People with disabilities, we have to adapt all the time. I was at a conference. I actually got to meet the vice president last year. She had a roundtable for people with disabilities talking about voting rights. And one of the people that I was in the conference with said something that I thought was great, and it's very, very true. We run into barriers the second we leave our house in the morning, and sometimes even inside our own house. If you're renting and you can't make your apartment fully accessible to meet your needs, we run into these obstacles all the time. And so we have to adapt. And so we bring that adaptability to the workforce, to our jobs, to our positions. We have a lot of outside the box thinking and look at things through a different lens. A lot of times that brings creativity and new ideas and fresh approaches to the workforce and to the environment, and has been really beneficial to businesses. And according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce report, leading practices on disability inclusion, hiring people with disabilities is actually good for the bottom line. Employers reported that providing accommodations resulted in such benefits as retaining valuable employees, improving productivity and morale, reducing workers' compensation and training costs, and improving company diversity. So we bring a lot of skills to the table that I don't think people really recognized before, that they're really starting to recognize now. People with disabilities, unfortunately, oftentimes we feel like we have something to prove. So these tend to be more dedicated employees. They feel like they have to prove that they belong there. And, that obviously is an attitude that we need to address. And hopefully one day we'll get to a point where everyone is equitable and we don't feel that need to kind of prove ourselves. But people with disabilities tend to show up to work on time. They don't miss as much work. They're very dedicated to their positions. They don't kind of goof off or screw around. Like, they are there to do the job, get their business done. And it brings company diversity, so that looking at the world through a different lens, that people didn't really think about before, that has proven very beneficial. And next slide. And I think this is important to talk about. We hear about diversity and inclusion efforts in employment. A lot of the times this doesn't include people with disabilities. We're talking about racial minorities. We're talking about the LGBTQ community. We're talking about women, people that exist at the intersection of all of these communities, but rarely is disability included in this. So, one of my favorite sayings, and it's kind of a rephrasing of one that exists, but if your diversity doesn't include disability, then it is not inclusive. And we often use diversity and inclusion interchangeably, as if these are the same thing. So that's why I love this picture. It is a picture of 2 plates of salad. So on the left-hand side, we have diversity, which is, you got the tomatoes, the carrots, the snap peas, the mushrooms, they're all on the plate together, but they're still separated. And we see this happen a lot with people with disabilities. We touched on sheltered workshops a lot of the time. So they're receiving sub-minimum wage. They're not working alongside non-disabled coworkers, even when people do enter the workforce, oftentimes, we have people with disabilities in the back breaking down boxes, or maybe they're the baggers at the grocery store, but they're not really given advancement opportunities. So they're part of the company diversity, but they're the carrots off to the left-hand side, right? They're not mixed in with the rest of the salad. So inclusion is, we have people from diverse backgrounds in all levels of our business. So there's people with disabilities on administrative teams. For Disabilities Rights Florida, they're on our first team, which is the intake line. They're secretaries, but they're also executive directors and directors of departments. And so that is what inclusion looks like, when we put everything in the salad and mix it all up together. And that is inclusion. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we have businesses working on improving their diversity and inclusion, and making sure they understand the distinction and they're focusing on inclusion as much as diversity. So that is it for me. We can go to the next slide. If anybody has questions or comments or any feedback, that is Disability Rights Florida's phone number and our website. If anybody needs our services, you can reach us on both of those. We have an online intake form for people experiencing discrimination due to disability. People always ask for like this laundry list of what we do and don't do, which I can't necessarily provide. We look at things on a case-by-case basis. We do operate, like I said, under our 9 federal grants. So we do have requirements and restrictions on what we can and can't do, but we always do information and referrals. So if there's a problem that we can address because it's outside the scope of our grants, we definitely will refer you to someone that may be able to offer that assistance. So that is all that I have. So I'm going to open it up for questions and comments.